Hey, good morning, folks. If you are here with us, we are just getting ready to launch Synerger's latest webinar about upgrade your company operating system with Matt Shaffer. We're going to get underway here in a minute or two to let a couple more folks drift in. So just hang tight and we'll be with you momentarily. Folks, we're just waiting a minute or two to let a few more folks arrive, and we should be underway here momentarily. Just stand by. We'll be going in the next 30 to 60 seconds. So hello, welcome to today's Synerger webinar, Upgrade Your Company Operating System with Matt Shaffer. I'm your host, Chris McNulty. We're going to spend the next 45 minutes or so walking through the company operating system in depth. We're going to spend a little bit of time introducing you to the webinar itself, how we're running it, and to our principal speaker today. We'll take some background. We'll look at some of the thought leadership that's been out there and get Matt's reaction to some of the meta issues that are driving the need for new management frameworks and operating systems. We'll look at some of the signals why you might need a company operating system. We're going to dig in depth to what it looks like to implement a company operating system, and we'll wrap up with some resources and some Q&A for you. So as we get going, a couple of quick housekeeping points. So we're doing this using Teams webinar, so you're not going to be able to come off mute, but if you have any questions, if you use the Q&A feature, which is typically at the top of your Teams window, you should be able to post a question and we'll answer it either as we go, or if we don't have time for it, we'll cover it in the Q&A at the end. And so this webinar is brought to you by Synerger. Synerger is a woman-owned strategic advisory agency that focuses on helping you find your North Star. We take an empathetic approach to be able to identify what things in your organization have the potential for strategic transformation, and then work with you on implementing that. Whether that is something like implementing a company operating system, looking at an M365 implementation and mapping it to your business goals and building a roadmap, looking at your AI strategy, redesigning your marketing and go-to-market. There are lots of services that we offer, and you can learn more about those at www.synerger.com. And these are just a couple of the clients whom we've worked with that you can see. We're proud to continue adding more and more and more over time. So today's guest, Matt Shaffer, has an interesting background. Say hi, Matt.
Hi, Matt.
So Matt has a background as diverse as, flying with the United States Air Force for over a decade, combined with being CEO of a real estate management firm, principal at a global consultant, and works with us at Synerger on strategic planning and organizational design. He is based just south of Denver, Colorado, in Colorado Springs, up high in the mountains where, Matt, I'm told it's already quite snowy.
It is.
So, And you can see just some of the clients that Matt has serviced in his portfolio here on the screen. So without further ado, let's take a look at some of the background that's going into this. So Matt, I'd like to kind of walk you through some of the background elements. So, recently the Vistage CEO group surveyed their leaders, and they found only 35% of them thought their resources were mapped into their priorities. Only half actually measure progress against goals with something that's already been defined, and about only 1 in 6 have any sort of established management framework. And that data is bolstered by some recent research from McKinsey about focusing on leadership. Only 7% of CEOs, according to McKinsey, believe their companies are investing in building effective leadership and effective leadership practices. So, Matt, I'd love to sort of ask you about that a little bit more. Like, in your experience, what are some of the reasons why lack of leadership development and lack of management focus is happening out there in the marketplace?
I think at the core, it's just a unawareness. We've got some great business people, great business leaders out there that are running successful companies. And, sometimes that's in spite of themselves. So when leaders and organizations just become aware of the power and the value of a management framework and about being intentional with this suite of tools, it has great success. On that Vistage slide you showed, and by the way, Vistage is a global company that puts CEO peer groups together. So those statistics came from an annual survey from CEOs across all sizes of organizations. And the 50% have goals and track them. That sounds very accurate, but if you notice the big disparity between that and the 17% only use a management framework, I think that shows the unawareness of the power of a management framework. We've been hearing about goals our whole life, our whole professional life of, if you want to get to where you want to go, set that goal and make sure you do the things to get there. So that's a very, very, very basic understanding that I think leaders have in general, but fewer of them have that discipline and have put things in place in an organization to have an intentional framework to go with goals, because goals are necessary, but they're insufficient.
So let me ask you, based on my experience at Microsoft, there's been, cataclysmic change, certainly over the past 5 years, from a pandemic to the rise of AI to you name it. And, almost consistently every year in Microsoft's executive briefings, I would sit down and use a standard slide that would say, the world is changing. And so there's definitely a rapid pace of change. Do you think that our organizations are just being overwhelmed by those external forces, or is it just momentum around maintaining the status quo, or something else going on?
I think the natural human behavior of taking the path of least resistance keeps organizations where they are with their disciplines, right? Because it could take some courage. It takes certainly intentionality of different flavors in order to implement something like a management framework and be disciplined about it, because, hey, you're probably going to have one more meeting during the week, right? You've got to have a couple workshops throughout the year. And that's just not the inclination of a leader to do that unless they are very proactive.
Fantastic. Well, let's look at the other star of today's webinar, which isn't just you, Matt. It is the company operating system. So, minor on-screen housekeeping. Are you able to advance the slides, or do you
Let
need
me
to continue?
take control here. And
Great.
yes. Okay, so let's talk about a company operating system, also synonymous with a business operating system. And if you went to management school in college back when I did decades ago, we called this a management framework. So the key word here is that it's an intentional and therefore documented framework. And the biggest value of this is it creates clarity and maintains that clarity and focus on business priorities, right? It gets the noise out of the way and puts the first things first. You maintain focus on those priorities by some practices that are in the operating system. And when you do this, you get to measure the effectiveness of the business, the effectiveness of the strategy, the effectiveness of the plan, not just KPIs. And so you maintain that awareness of how is our performance when you get to a very disciplined, I call it a rhythm of regularly meetings. And the weekly meeting is the weekly focus meeting because it's that rhythm of making sure we're looking at our priorities and are our plans and our strategy executing the way we expect them to.
Terrific.
So we think about the purpose, why do it, right? Purpose is very synonymous with why of a company OS. It aligns things. And to me, alignment is everything. Get your people, your resources, and your plans all aligned so that you're not just kind of hoping, because hope's not a strategy, of what you're doing is working, or what maybe what you're doing is working, and you want to hope it continues to work. But this gives some predictability around getting to the destination, the vision, those annual goals, those 3 or 5 year targets of where you want to be as well. And the analogy to a company OS is this operating system inside a business, a company, or an organization really makes all the pieces work together in a coherent system for an expected output, much like an operating system for computers that we've been accustomed to working with for a while.
So, Matt, I know you're going to walk us through these key components of a company operating system. So let me just emphasize those are business foundation, strategy, annual plan, and a focus rhythm. So let's start with business foundation, because that could mean a lot of things to a lot of people. In the context of a company operating system, what's a business foundation?
Business foundation has 5 essential pieces, right? And we've all heard of these, but when you put them together, they're very foundational. The purpose is the why we exist, why our business kind of, quote, gets out of bed in the morning, right? Why are we here to make the world a better place? The mission is what we do in order to fulfill that purpose, right? This looks like what business are you in? Vision is where we actually want to get to, or where this is a very altruistic kind of thing of, if we lived out our purpose and our mission for years and we arrived at some aspirational goal, that would be the vision, of course. And then targets are actually measures, right, of how are we doing? And they all must center around and be built on the core values of the company, right, which really shape a set of behaviors, which we call a culture. And so if you don't have those core values documented, you're not going to have cohesion amongst the culture and the leadership and the behaviors in the organization in order to get to your vision by accomplishing your purpose, by performing your mission.
Okay, so that's business foundations. What's next?
Strategy. So I love this definition of strategy. It's a set of integrated choices that put you on a playing field of your choice so that you will win. And the really key 2 words here are integrated choices, right? For a long time, and I see this so often, that people think strategy and plan are kind of the same thing, right?
Right. I mean, I know that we've always thought strategic planning is a really important business term, but you've educated me on what some of the distinctions are and why those are not the same thing and don't belong in the same phrase.
Yes, and the word strategic tends to imply long-term, it tends to imply a little more complex as opposed to tactical, which is usually short-term and one very specific thing. We often think of a strategy as a group of tactics, but in business, it's choices. And I like to kind of think of it as an if-then statement or a series of if-then statements, right? If we do this, and if we do this, and if we make this choice, we make this choice to go here, we make this choice to have this capability, we believe, therefore, that our potential customers will choose us over the competition. So there's a little bit of crossover between strategy and a plan, but strategic is more about the choices that are usually long-term, and the plans fulfill those choices. And we'll talk about that here in a sec.
Great.
Here's strategy versus planning. A couple differences are the end goals, right? Think of a project. A project usually has a deliverable, it has output. A strategy has an outcome, where an outcome could be our company's in a new place in a market. We have a new capability. We're breaking into a new geography or a new sector. These are outcomes. A big, big difference in strategy and planning. And this is the first test that you should ask yourself when you think, is this choice or this operation, this initiative, this project, is it strategic or is this really a plan? Is who has control? In a strategy, you're making a choice that will have customers hopefully choose you, and your customers are in control of making that choice. In a plan, such as, hey, let's move into a new geography and open up an office in Asia, or let's increase our manufacturing capability, or let's change things in our restaurant to actually offer a whole different menu section. You're in control of those. Your customer is not, you are. They're in control of whether they choose you or not. So the control, who's in control, is a great indicator of, is this a strategic thing we're talking about, or is this a plan? So because your customers are in control, that's very uncomfortable. It's more comfortable when we're in control. And again, back to the if-then statements, we think if we make these choices, this will happen with our customers and they'll choose us for this reason. And the risk and unknowns in your customer choosing you are very high. And in planning, the risk is kind of low because if you've got the capital, you can actually go make your plans happen.
Terrific. So, I know we make a distinction between what's strategic and what's operational. Just quick question. I know from your military background, this looks like some sort of Air Force acronym, BOW FTD. Can you tell us what that means in context of strategy and operations?
Believe it or not, these actually are not military acronyms. Operational is business as usual, or something I learned when I got in the consulting world about 20 years ago is feed the beast, where the beast and the business as usual is the engine of your operation, right? In a restaurant, it could just be making the food and serving the food and cleaning up every night. In a software engineering firm, it's making and releasing the software and all the project management that goes into that, right? So we talked about strategy versus planning previously. Now let's take a little bit of a different lens, a different angle, and talk about the strategic versus the operational. I want you to imagine you're looking at a blank sheet of paper and you've got a horizontal line across dividing the paper. So you got a top section and a bottom section, right? Let's imagine that the strategic things are on the top and the operational is on the bottom, right? Your strategy are going to be those choices that you're going to make so that your customer choose you. And this greatly has an emphasis on the plans as well about how are we going to get to this strategy. And below on the operational side, this is where we see measures such as KPIs of, is our engine, our beast, feed the beast, our business as usual, is it running well, right? So these might look like daily, weekly type of operational measures to ensure the engine is working. We're on top in the strategic plan, we're going to be measuring, is our strategy working? Are our customers making the choices we expected they would, right? And this has a longer tail on it as well. So it's very important to think differently about strategy and planning and to think differently about the strategic and the operational in a company operating system.
Got it. Thanks.
So the third component is our annual plan. And you have a question about that? You want to kick it off?
You said before, hope is not a strategy. Hope is not a plan either. What is a plan?
A plan could be, it's an annual objectives, your annual targets, which are your measures, where you want to get the measures of your targets for the year, and breaking that into quarterly priorities as well. So at the top, annual objectives, these are really the priorities for the year, right? These should look very outcome focused. A new capability, success in a new sector. And these are things that are really going to move the needle in the company, right? And you shouldn't have more than 5 of these. 3 to 5 is optimal because if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, right? So this is really where the focus comes into play of this year or the upcoming year. We should be talking about in December now. These are our priorities and these are the targets we're going to set that we want to reach. It might be sales, revenue, customer satisfaction, right? And then every quarter we're going to meet and break those down into quarterly rocks, right? Or things that are important to get done in this quarter in order to achieve those targets and fulfill our priorities at the annual level. super important to have those quarterly rock meetings. And that kind of looks like a workshop, just like the annual plan does. And you want to look back how we do last quarter and then plan next quarter's rocks as well.
Okay, so how do you, I think the next part is just understanding, how do you make that plan real? Like, many folks, and I'm certainly counting myself among them, go through the idea of an annual planning cycle. You convene your team, you go to some fabulous destination, which may be a different meeting room than the one you usually use. And you write a lot of things on whiteboards and you put them on slides and you develop an annual plan, and then you tuck it into your digital filing cabinet, not to be looked at again for a year. I think there's, as you've shared with me, there's more to it than just that. How do you carry that forward and make it real?
Yeah, for sure. When we do that annual planning, right, we kind of save that little carved out piece of budget to go to that nice steakhouse or that nice location, and we sit down and we talk about big ideas and quote strategic things, and we walk away going, "Wow, we did strategic planning, and we've got a plan for next year, right?" And we set some targets. That's great. That's a very necessary but incredibly insufficient piece of actually getting from where you are to where you want to go, right? So we want to have our scorecard, because what gets measured gets managed. Love that. I didn't learn this in the military either. I learned it in the business world. If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. So every week we're going to look at our scorecard. We're going to have our annual plan. We're going to do our quarterly planning. And then the real magic of this focus rhythm is your weekly focus meeting, right? It has a very specific agenda where we're going to look at our quarterly rocks every week and say if they're on track or they're off track, right? We're going to look at the scorecard and have a review for that. We're going to roll through our to-dos, and then about half the meetings is problem solving for that week. So the bridge between, we had our annual strategic planning meeting, and we're actually taking very intentional action to stay focused on our priorities for the year, is this weekly focus meeting. Because when you put the target metrics in the scorecard up there each week, when you review the rocks that individuals sign up for on the team that's doing this, and they have to report on track or off track, it's not really about accountability of poking someone as, are you done yet or not? It's just about keeping the priorities front and center, and never getting into a position of hope or where we're kidding ourselves about our things working, because we're actually looking at the scorecard. So that focus rhythm on the weekly basis is really where the magic happens on that very specific agenda.
Awesome. So signs you may need a new company operating system, or even any operating system at all. Like, how can an organization understand that they may be out of bounds and that there's a way to get them back into harmony and moving forward?
Yeah, for sure. First, it starts with a conversation and asking a lot of questions. Kind of looks like a workshop, right? And a number of the things that we look at when we go, how great is the need for a company operating system here, is we look at the business foundations, right? Most people have core values. Hopefully individuals do. Most organizations have those core values in place. And, at the lowest end, they're undocumented. They're just conversational. And in all of these components inside a company operating system, having them documented and having them become ingrained in the culture and part of the way of life, and actually getting reviewed and talked about on a regular basis, if not measured, that's really the magic of going from the lower maturity on the left side to a higher maturity. So, mission, vision, value, purpose, those things are sometimes conversational. Then they move to, hey, they're on the lobby, they're framed in a picture. And then if their organization is very mature about it, they actually integrate these things into, such as the company annual or a person's annual review, right? They may choose a core value to talk about at every company meeting or every team meeting, just spend 3 minutes on it talking about how somebody actually lived out a core value. Same with goals. They could be conversational. They could be measured and looked at regularly. Strategy, I more often than not don't see a documented strategy with teams and organizations. They talk about where they want to go. They set goals and they're like, hey, let's get there. and they will do a great thing of empowering their managers and their people to get there. But the intentionality of saying, if we think we make these choices in the marketplace, we believe our customer is going to choose us, just doesn't exist. So the very mature side of that is measuring consistently and regularly, are those choices working? And then if you got a small to mid-sized company, the dependence on the founders is always an indicator of, do they need this systematic approach to a management framework, this company operating system? Because as you know, when you start up, the founder kind of does everything. You're wearing all 30 hats. And on the mature side, we want them kind of sitting on the board and just advising, because there's structure in place in order to keep the company functioning.
Yeah, and I do think one of the important points is, when you look at any of these maturity models, it requires that honest assessment of where you are. But if you look at this and you average out all those scores, and you may see yourself better at some areas than other, you may average out to be 175 or something.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that your plan should necessarily be to go to 500. First and foremost, you may not need to be at 500 level. Like, it may be better for the company to keep a founder more actively engaged than you might think otherwise. And so, I think there's a cost in moving farther to the right. Also, there's a change management function, right? Like, if you could snap your fingers and go from 100 to 500 in a day, it doesn't mean that your organization would keep up with you. So, I think what's important here is to be able to use this as a benchmark to assess, are we making progress? Are we getting better at this? That's, I think, the real intent behind any of these maturity models.
Agreed. I think, like you said, every organization across these 5 areas here are going to be at different places at different times in their journey. I'd say having business foundations, get them into a 200 level, right, or 300 level, where they're actually documented and agreed upon. That is the most critical part, because as it says, foundations, that serves as the basis and the guiding principles of all decisions you're going to make that affect the goals, strategy, how you execute a management framework, and how that founder is integrated. So definitely get those business foundations in place first, and then it's going to be tailored to each organization about, okay, where do we need to put our emphasis next?
Great. Let's look at some of the why as well. I'd love to kind of have you walk us through, what do you get by implementing a company operating system?
Sure. Top line, it's all about clarity and focus on those priorities, right? Everyone's on the same sheet of music. What's an outcome of that? You get better business performance, right? Increased accountability with people. People are clear on, what's my part in how we're going to get to the vision? What's my part in the mission? What's my part in helping contribute or lead my team to our annual plan? And I'm probably going to own some rocks if I'm on the team or leadership team that meets about his company operating system as well. So the scorecard piece and being intentional about documenting these things really takes you from anecdotal and conversation into honest measurement and decisions. Because sometimes if, we sit down, we look at the P&L and we go, hey, wow, we're making money and our employees are happy, kind of stops there. And, that's a good place to be, but organization could be so much further down the road in their success if they were just intentional about measuring the business. So when you measure it and you see what's working, what's not working, that gives you some agility. And when we all know where we're going, right, back to that unity, then there's reduced anxiety of, we just know what swim lane we're supposed to be in. People aren't crossing each other in application of resources, and it's a more comfortable place to be and work.
Great.
And I think we just talked about a lot of those here on these next few slides.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I think it's kind of good to chat about each of these, and of course, we'll share these slides with folks if you're looking for more detail. But thanks for walking us through all of that. Can we just talk a little bit more just about not just measurement, but honest measurement?
Yeah, for sure. I heard there's a great saying I love in business that said, people will stretch the truth about numbers, but numbers don't stretch the truth about people.
Right.
so numbers are so empirical that when you put those right measures in place, it stops us from kidding ourselves about the business performance, because we could be distracted or disillusioned by some victory or success we're having over here on this part of our team or our business, and might be turning a bit of a blind eye to another part that we're actually measuring and need to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about being honest, this isn't that we're lying about anything at work or in our management. It's about looking at the data so that we can't kid ourselves about how well the business is or is not performing.
Fantastic. Let's look forward. What does it look like on the ground to bring a new company operating system um, into effectiveness?
Yeah, the first thing is really to educate. You're going to educate the participants, which is often the leadership team. It's always the leadership team. It might be a little broader than that. And if the audience is a bit broader than that, then you have to educate them on what are these components, right? And why are we doing it? There's a taxonomy exercise of what do we call these different components that has to be done in the beginning, because people use interchangeably goals, objectives, priorities, targets, metrics. So there's really not a wrong answer there, but how are we going to use it? Because if you implement this thoroughly, a metric can clearly be a different thing than a priority, which can be a different thing than a goal or a target, right? So just getting on the same page is part of that educate process. And then you have to get people's buy-in, right?
Right.
Good leadership is you want to sell them on the idea so that they self-motivate to be part of the company operating system. And every organization needs a tailored approach, right? Like we talked about on that maturity slide, every organization's at a different spot in their journey. There are some things that are just immovable inside of an organization that you might need to incorporate into these core components, but you need to make it fit that organization. This is a framework, right? It's a management framework. And a framework is not a rigid system that is not malleable and can't change. A framework is a set of core concepts that can be tailored to what you need. And this can be executed, company operating system, on paper. That's how I did it years ago when I was running a company to start with, or it could be digital as well. Everything from an Excel spreadsheet to a more sophisticated system such as Microsoft Viva, right? And so there's a lot of flexibility there. Which format you choose it's important that it's appropriate to your organization, the culture, and where they at on the level of digital sophistication. Getting the right
Mm-hmm.
tool isn't going to help you anymore when you're starting. The practices and the framework are what's most important when you're starting.
Thank you.
Couple of the leading practices when we go to implement are, again, educate. We intentionally repeated that. Choose your framework. There's a number out there. EOS is one of the most popular and simple, easy to get started on systems for especially a small business. You can move through. Scaling Up is another one that's out there. And OKRs, objectives and key results, were made kind of famous by Google. They were actually invented a few decades before, but Google made them famous. And there's softwares that can work with all those, or you could do it on paper. Again, I mentioned determine your taxonomy. It's such a key point. I've seen clients that kind of missed this step or didn't give this step discipline, and it actually creates confusion when they get in a weekly meeting or quarterly planning. And it's so easily avoidable by just determining that taxonomy. Get a consultant to facilitate. Notice facilitate is the key word here, because this isn't hire a consultant that knows your market is going to come in and tell you which strategic choice you could make. That'd be a good consultant too. But it's a skill to just be able to facilitate this process and draw out of the leadership team the components that go into that framework.
Matt, on that, how much of that is the skill of the consultant and knowing about new frameworks and operating systems, and how much is the benefit of having a fresh pair of eyes and a neutral observer to challenge some, orthodoxies that may be hamstringing the organization?
I'd say those are both advantages of getting an outside consultant.
Okay.
And a third bonus is there are consultants out there that have never really been operational leaders or C-level leaders and had this, and they're pretty good facilitators with meetings. But if you can get a facilitator, a consultant that's actually been operational and been in the chair and lived through the pain before, Uh, that brings a lot more insight. Not only is the being the third outside party with a different opinion, as you mentioned, but it brings a real empathy to the stresses, the pressures, and the risks that those leaders are experiencing that you're facilitating those workshops with. Again, here we're talking
Great.
about honesty. Let
Mhm.
data be the bad guy, right? Point the fingers at the data if the data isn't good, but again, not kidding ourselves around data. And again, the best practice is that weekly focus meeting is just non-negotiable. It's immutable. It should not ever be moved unless it like falls on a federal holiday or a company holiday. And I would even say, having been in the client consulting world for a long time, uh, don't move this for a client meeting. Do everything you can to get your client to move their meeting. This is just a
Yep.
immovable object, right?
I would just I would note um, where I've used this approach in my past. We've always set that meeting to be on Thursdays, just because there are so many Monday holidays and so many Fridays where people are taking off. Thursdays are a much more non-negotiable day than
Yeah.
all of the Monday holidays.
Yep.
Let's talk. I know we're approaching the end of time here. I'd love to get a sense from you of um, we've talked a lot about data and letting you say right here, let data be the bad guy, and the importance of measuring the goals. What does it look like practically when a new company operating system is implemented? What does success actually look like? What are I'd love to hear an example of some of those outcomes.
Sure. So if we go back to thinking about the strategic above the line and the operational below the line, let's call our measures about the business targets on top, right? Think
Mhm.
annual revenue, might be quarterly revenue. It could be market penetration. Um, and there's some measures below the line, which I typically call KPIs because they're about how is our engine performing. They're the key indicators there. Um, I just totally blanked out on your question as well. I got so focused on KPIs.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Bring me
talk
back.
through. Yeah, I just wanted to talk through what are what does it look like? Can
Ah,
you
yes,
walk us through a real world example of what the implementation looked like and what some of those benefits are?
for sure. So above the line in the strategic, right, we have some hard targets, so to speak, of think revenue, it might be profit, customer sat, like we mentioned. Um, but in those quarterly rocks as well, a rock might look like a project to implement a system or a feature in the system that supports the business, right? Sometimes those measures are subjective of how done are we with this project. But it's super important to track to make sure that on a quarterly basis, we're actually taking the necessary steps that should help us arrive where we need to be at the end of the year. And below the line on those operational measures that, like I said, I like to call them KPIs, looking at those every week will help keep us honest. And those could look like everything from marketing metrics to the what is our engine if it's software engineering? Are we releasing on time? That'll look like every piece of the engine, the scorecard, and those measures in the scorecard. There's probably going to be a couple or a few dozen in there, right? And you don't have to drain that scorecard slide when you look at it every week, but you want to do look at the highlights and see there any causes in the operation in the engine causing our numbers to go a little bit askew.
So, Matt, you've got a reference up here in the screen to some of Synergy's experience at implementing a new company operating system for a North American luxury brand. Walk us through it.
You bet. So this is the company that had been around a little over 20 years, I believe, had been successful. They're profitable. And when they contacted us, they kind of were ready to know what they didn't know about how to get to the next stage of growth, right? So
Hmm.
they originally called us about a digital transformation. And when we showed up and did some workshops with them, we realized that an organizational transformation is really what they were ready for in their journey. So the Synergy team came in and did some workshops and figured out, help them understand where do they need to go and how to get there. And the first piece was implementing a company operating system, because even though they were greatly successful with a great product and a great culture, They weren't as successful as they could be, and they didn't have this intentionality and rigor around some measures and some disciplines, goals, targets we see in a company operating system. They needed to they needed to change the org chart a bit and move the founders into a slightly different role and augment that executive leadership with some new C-suite positions. So they filled those roles, and this was the same time we were implementing the company operating system, and it was a super effective way to get those leaders on the same page at the same time about where are we and where do we want to go and how are we going to get there, to create those plans to get there. So timing was very fortuitous, and we helped them. What we typically do is with weekly focus meetings, we set in with them. We lead the first couple and then hand it off and let someone else lead while we're there to help coach if needed, if they want to lean on us. And then we're out of the picture in about 4 weeks after the weekly focus meetings. And I want to mention one thing about the weekly focus meeting that's interesting, I missed before, is that's not a meeting of authority. That's a meeting of ensuring we're all on the same page, and a different person, regardless of their level in the organization on that team, could lead that every week. And that's what I've seen this client do as well. So it's been a resounding success for them, and they have a really clear picture of how are we performing and are we meeting our goals or not.
Let me just ask you one thing about the implementation. I'm just really curious. This just occurred to me. So sometimes change can lead to discomfort. People definitely have a comfort with status quo. And you mentioned earlier, sometimes strategic choices are intended to be uncomfortable. Do you find that discomfort is actually a sign that you're doing something that is a real change, or is discomfort a signal that you should be looking at a different implementation approach?
You're not having change if you're not uncomfortable.
Okay.
Right. Change is getting outside of the comfort zone, whether organizationally or personally, right? And if you're not in that uncomfortable spot, if your strategy is not in that uncomfortable, unknowing spot, then you're just doing the same thing over and over again, right? Now, how do you mitigate? You want to mitigate risk. I say, how do you mitigate the discomfort? I don't know if you really can mitigate that, but where there's discomfort, ensure that there's mitigation of that risk or unknowns that's causing that discomfort.
Fantastic. Well, Matt, thank you for walking us through the company operating system and one of your recent examples. It's really insightful. I was not aware of all of those aspects of COS when you were rolling that out earlier. So it's just about time to wrap up. We're going to take a few minutes. If you have a question that you'd like to see us address, please post it into the Q&A. One question that has already come in, let me start with this one, Matt. The question is, I'm only involved at a team level in my organization. Do I need to involve my whole company to get started with a new operating system?
No. Use the business operating system acronym, if you like, their term for that. But if you've got a team in a larger company or inside of an enterprise, you can use the same business foundations as the company does, right? As the parent, you may not have the autonomy. It might not be smart to create new core values or a new vision or a new mission of what we do. So fall under the umbrella of the parent, so to speak, whatever the parent might be and where you are, and you can do all these same things in your team.
Fantastic. So I'm just going to wait a minute, see if we got a couple more questions in here. While we're waiting for that, I just wanted to flash up a couple of resources while we're waiting for questions. If you are interested in exploring this in more detail, we would love to do a planning workshop with you. So if you follow the link here, and I'll also add that to the chat here momentarily, you can request scheduling time with us to figure out what a workshop to help plan a company operating system or any other transformation you're looking at might look in your organization. We have a number of resources that are available at aka.synerger.com/COS, including a recent podcast, Matt, that you were our guest on. links to a couple of case studies, the one that we just walked through, as well as another implementation that was done at Microsoft about 2 years ago. Just encourage you to be able to also stay connected with us through Synerger.com and follow us on social. So I don't see any more questions coming in. So Matt, I wanted to thank you for your time. I'd like to thank our hosts at Synerger for making this podcast available to the community. And of course, I want to thank all of our attendees today for taking time from a busy day to spend it with us. And hopefully you learned something. So I just wanted to say, again, thank you. We're recording this today, approaching the holiday season. So from Synerger, please take our best wishes for something, for a peaceful and safe holiday. And I see a question has just come in, or we saw a hand coming up. So Cham, if you have a question, if you could type it into the Q&A, that would be great.
I see his Q&A in there. It says I mentioned ROT or ROT a few times.
Yes.
I don't remember ROT or ROT, so somebody wants to help me remember. I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, I know that ROT, I've used that in the context of migrations, which is completely separate from a company operating system, but to look at redundant, obsolete, or trivial information. So if you've got more detail, Cham, please add it into the chat or the Q&A. If not, we can follow up offline.
Good.
Okay, that's it. We will wrap the webinar. Thank you again for spending time with us. Take all of our best wishes for a peaceful and happy holiday season, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks,
Chris.